Grant Shapps is former British Secretary of Defense. Welcome to our program, Mr. Shapps.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
What are the chances for a ceasefire in Ukraine this year?
Well, look, I mean, clearly there's been a huge amount of bloodshed, and everyone wants to see the conflict come to an end. I think it has to come to an end in a just way from the perspective of both Ukraine, which after all is the country which has unambiguously been invaded, and also from our wider security as those of us who live on the European continent. And so I have some deep concerns about the potential shape of that peace settlement, but we will have to see, because it's too early to know at this stage exactly what that would look at. I'm sure everyone would welcome peace, but I don't think it should be peace at any price. And in particular, we shouldn't let a dictator in Putin feel like he's had the upper hand, because that would be serious for future conflicts.
Do you believe that US President Donald Trump can really bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table and force him to make a serious peace deal?
Well, I'm certain that he'll bring him to the negotiating table. What worries me is that he may do that by making too many concessions on behalf of Ukraine, and indeed without Ukraine, in advance of those discussions. President Trump is often, certainly describes himself as an expert negotiator. It's an unusual negotiation in which you give up a number of key cards in advance of sitting down at the table. So I make no bones about it. I've been concerned with some of the things that he's been saying. On the other hand, this has been a long time in coming. Clearly, no one wants to see bloodshed. So again, it's hard to know without seeing the outcome and the shape of such a deal. But I have some significant misgivings about it, if I'm being honest.
Do you feel that US President Trump has already gave up some cards to Vladimir Putin by ruling out membership in NATO and also making other statements about the Ukrainian ability to regain its own territories?
Yes, I do. And I think the problem, though, is that Europe, for far too long, has talked about security, but not been prepared to spend money on it. Europe spent on defense at about the same level as the Americans, say 3.5% or something of their GDP on defense. We wouldn't be in this position. We wouldn't be reliant on the Americans. We wouldn't be subject to America, a country which isn't even on our continent, drawing the boundaries of countries, Ukraine in this case, Ukraine and Russia. So we are responsible for this ourselves in the end result as Europe, for not having spent enough money on defense over a sufficient period of time. And I say that as somebody who was formerly the defense secretary for Europe's biggest spender in financial terms in Europe. But even I don't think we were spending enough as Britain, and certainly not enough as the rest of Europe.
Also, do you feel that Ukraine has now its own seat on the negotiating table?
Well, I mean, absolutely essential Ukraine is there. You cannot have a peace without a country that's been invaded sitting around a table. And I do worry, and I'm going to say this out loud to you. I do worry that President Trump, who thinks himself a master at making deals, seems to be far too close to President Putin on this. President Putin invaded. There was no vacation. There was no excuse. He's broken international law. He's sent hundreds of thousands of Russians to their death, and of course caused the deaths of many Ukrainians as well. He is a dictator who doesn't just cancel or run, rather, illegitimate elections. He murders his opponents and knocks them up as well. It's the idea that the leader of the free world can't distinguish between who the dictator is here is absolutely abhorrent. And so it is essential, and whilst I would welcome a peace, it needs to be a just peace. Otherwise, Putin will simply take the time to regather and try and come back again and come back stronger. So I think it is concerning that Ukraine was locked out of the initial discussions. I believe that will change. I think we'll see President Zelensky in Washington by the end of the week. And I hope when that happens, that there's a change in tone and all of this turns out to have been a masterful negotiating technique by President Trump. My concern is that that's not the way it looks at the moment.
US President Donald Trump said that he was confident that Vladimir Putin would accept European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. Can you imagine a scenario in which Putin says okay to European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine?
Yeah, I can actually, and I think part of the conversation is likely to be true. The question always on these things is what has to be given up in return for peace. And I suspect the kind of deal the president has in mind is that President Putin, Russia, keeps territory that it invaded, well, actually all the way back to 2014, in some cases like Crimea, in return for a peace, which in return would probably be secured by having European forces on the ground, and essentially also it will require American security guarantees. Otherwise, President Putin would, I'm sure, think nothing after a period of time of trying to push further again. So this all depends on the terms on which such a deal is struck. And I have always felt that in the end, this is your country. Ukraine belongs to the Ukrainians. It's up to you if you want to accept the long-awaited peace in return for territory, and that shouldn't be other countries forcing you to do that. And it's certainly something that the United Kingdom, as I think and believe, the number one supporter of Ukraine in this war, should never push you to do if it's against your own interests. That has to be a judgment for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
The United Kingdom, France, and other allies are ready to deploy troops to Ukraine, up to 30,000 troops, according to the recent publication in the media. Also, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will present his plan to Donald Trump this week about deployment of European peacekeeping forces. And my first question will be, is British Army capable of conducting such large-scale operations on the ground in Ukraine without American role?
Yes, we are, is the answer. And a lot is made of the size of, yes, I've been defense secretary, these conversations have happened many times over. A lot is made about the size specifically of the British Army. And then a lot of people conflate the army to be the entire military. We spend about £66 billion. That's probably, to the top of my head, 75, 80 billion euros a year on our military. We are pretty significant, as I say, the second biggest spenders, or the biggest spender in Europe, second biggest in NATO outside of America. And when it comes to troops, although, of course, people like me who've been defense secretary always want to see more troops in place, we have, for example, a rapid reaction force with France, which can produce 10,000 troops very quickly. We've been looking for contributions from all European states, of course, who are, after all, should be interested in securing the peace in Europe. So we'd be expecting everyone to contribute. But yes, I do think it would be doable. Again, though, none of us has seen the details of an agreement yet, because there isn't one. So the only way that we could, a British Prime Minister, would send troops would be if the wider security situation has been properly negotiated and is being guaranteed by the Americans.
Also, British Prime Minister will ask Donald Trump to commit and to support this mission, for example, by providing additional air defense systems or by deploying on standby some air power in the countries near Ukraine to react if Russia violates a ceasefire agreement. Could this mission be credible without American commitment if Trump says no to this proposal from the British Prime Minister?
Well, there'd be different levels of American assistance which could make all the difference. One of which is American has significant ability on what's called ISTAR. So this is the ability to look at what's happening on the ground space or other assets. And that's very, very important. And America has the facility to do that in a very big way. So that's one example of the type of military assistance that would be required. I think there's something else which has nothing to do with military assistance in the short term. But I do think that a deal needs to be under the assumption and very clear basis that to Putin and to Russia from America, that although they're not on the ground with Europeans helping to ensure this peace, he is very clear that if you come in and you do not, this is to Russia, if you breach this, whatever the agreement is, the ceasefire and the terms of it, then America will thump you very, very hard. And for all my misgivings about President Trump's behavior and language in this last sort of week, I have to remind your viewers that actually he was really quite strong in other arenas where other leaders would have hesitated during his first term in office, and would frequently go in and properly deal with countries or terrorist organizations that stepped outside of the norms. So I think he has the capacity to do that. But again, so much of this is supposition. In other words, we don't really know until we see the terms of an agreement, and there are no terms of an agreement right now.
And do you believe that such British and other French troops should fight back if they are being attacked by the Russian side? I mean, in case of this mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. There shouldn't be like a sort of a UN peacekeeping, blueberry approach where you sort of scarper at the first signs of trouble or something. This has to be a proper military force. We are members of NATO. France and Britain, the European countries that are members of NATO, would be joining this. Attacking our troops would be, in my view, have to be an Article 5 moment. In other words, under NATO, and this would be our troops, so they would be NATO troops. If our troops are attacked, then it's considered to be an attack on all the countries, regardless of whether it's a French, British, or any other nationality member of the military who's attacked. So it's got to be a collective thing.
Let's also cover Russia and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. General Budanov, head of Ukrainian military intelligence, said that Russian political and military leadership for the first time realized that it had made a terrible mistake in 2022. Do you think that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and his generals regret invading Ukraine?
Well, they'll never say that, of course. They'll always spin it as some great success for Mother Russia. Let's be completely blunt about it. What have we learned? We've learned that the Russian army, the former Red Army, is a fraction of what the world always assumed it to be. We imagined as Western leaders that this was a really tough, capable, technologically advanced army, and they demonstrated exactly the opposite. Their vehicles got stuck in mud. Their approach to the strategy of campaigning has been appalling. They thought they'd be in Kyiv within 72 hours of the 24th of February 2022. Never mind 3 days, it's 3 years, and they're not managed to make it anywhere near Kyiv. So actually, this has been a terrible embarrassment for Russia and for Putin in particular. As I say, he'll never admit it. He'll never tell people at home why inflation is running so high in Russia, why people are suffering so much. But he has been personally responsible for disgracing Russia in the eyes of the international community, demonstrating that his military is a fraction of what everyone assumed it was, and making himself a total pariah. I think people should be ashamed to associate with.
And how we can make sure Russia will not use this time of a ceasefire just to rebuild its army, its military potential, and to attack another time in the future? And what is your take on the question of sanctions against Russian military-industrial complex in this matter after ceasefire? Can they just use this time to just build and produce more missiles?
Of course, that will be the concern. And it's very important that We do not let that happen. It's just this week, the United Kingdom has increased again sanctions against Russia. I think sanctioning another couple of hundred people, and 3 years in, we've sanctioned a lot of Russian money and people. It's important that the West carries on doing that, and certainly Europe. To answer your question, the quality of the peace discussion and agreement is really the main driver behind. I have no doubt at all that if President Putin thought that he could get away with it by rebuilding in, say, 12 or 18 months his military facilities and then being able to go in, as he would see it, for the kill and actually take over Ukraine, he'd do that. The quality of the agreement's got to be such that there is every disincentive for Putin, including those American guarantees, but most critically of all, Europe finally wakes up the threat that is the Russian bear on its eastern border and gets its own act together to spend properly on defense. And I think in that area, we are finally seeing the right kind of response. When I was defense secretary, I put our defense spending up to 2.5% of our GDP, of our economy. Unfortunately, this current government dropped that temporarily, but yesterday, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has come back and said, no, we will do this 2.5%, and in fact, we'll do it faster. And I strongly welcome that, but we need to go further. Most other European nations are still a long way behind us. We're by a long way the biggest spender in cash terms, and a lot of other nations need to get up to 2%, let alone 2.5%. But I do think that the one thing that Trump has done, and here I congratulate him, is taken Europe out of this era of complacency, that America will always do our dirty work. They'll always pay for it. They're not going to do that now. And Europe's understood that. And I'm seeing that finance ministers, prime ministers, presidents all around Europe have suddenly woken up to this idea. And I think we'll see a big increase, therefore, in European defense spending. And in the end, that is the thing which will stop Putin from continuing to invade Western countries.
Do you expect the United Kingdom to lift sanctions against Russia if there is a ceasefire deal?
Well, I don't expect any time soon. Again, this is too much speculation in as much as we don't know the terms of the deal. So you could see terms of a deal in which Putin agrees X, Y, Z, and we agree ABC, and therefore, part of that might be lifting of sanctions over a period of time. Personally, I feel that until Russia has paid really for perhaps some compensation for the disaster, the destruction, loss of life, which you can never bring back, we shouldn't rush to release sanctions. But again, let's wait to see the shape of the deal. Let's see if it's acceptable to you in Ukraine, and let's be guided by that and by yourselves as to when and how and if we should raise or even begin to normalize relations.
And also, do you expect the UK government to support Ukraine, provide Ukraine with another military packages if there is a ceasefire deal in place and made by both sides?
Well, one of the things that, look, I don't know the exact shape of that, but one of the things that I pioneered as a defense secretary was what I called the 100-year partnership between Ukraine and the United Kingdom. And I came up with this as a concept because clearly we have had very strong military ties during this conflict, and indeed before it, when we were already training Ukrainians in Britain after 2014, so before the main conflict in 2022. We provided anti-tank missiles, NLAWs, for the conflict, and then since the conflict, all manner of different weapons and tools. But I realized that military assistance was just really part of it. We've also welcomed Ukrainians to this country. In fact, in my own home, we had 3 Ukrainians who lived with us for a year, still in the United Kingdom, and that wasn't an exceptional story. Many Brits had Ukrainians come to live with them. And it really occurred to me that we should form a partnership, I've called it the 100-year partnership, which should go on forever, really, where we take those very strong military, the very strong social bonds between us, and we expand them into education, into science, into trade, and really standing as we do on the west and the east of continental Europe, and at least the democratic part of it, we should work together to create this fantastic 100-year partnership. And I was really delighted last month or the month before when the Prime Minister the current Prime Minister, came to Kyiv, met with President Zelensky, and pushed forward this 100-year partnership, which, as I say, I originally came up with. So I think that I don't know exactly the answer to your question on the military front. That really will depend on what the arrangements are. But I'm absolutely certain that there is a sort of closeness, a sort of bond between Brits and Ukrainians that this war has demonstrated, enlarged, and I think will now play out over many, many years.
And I would like to conclude our conversation with a final question for you regarding your political heritage and your also biggest successes and regrets. What are your biggest, from your perspective, achievements and regrets after you concluded your work as a defense secretary?
Well, I think actually, as defense secretary, my biggest achievement was a year ago. I made a speech in London at the beginning of 2024, where I said the world has changed. We've moved from a sort of post-Second World War era, post-war to pre-war era, where we need to prepare ourselves. And I called on all nations, but Europe in particular, to increase its defense spending to 2.5%. And I was able to convince our then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Chancellor to pay for that. And we set the path to 2.5%. I think that was my proudest achievement, really waking up the world to the idea we can't go on as we were. Unfortunately, as I say, there was a little bit of stuttering over that. It went backwards for the last 8 months under the current British government, but even they have now woken up to the idea and announced yesterday that we must get to that 2.5% and then 3% and higher, which I've also been calling for. So I think that would be the most significant thing. It was picked up by NATO countries, echoed by other European and international leaders. I also think, though, possibly the most long-term impact may well be the thing we were last talking about, which is, for whatever reason, there's this huge commonality of interest between Britain and Ukraine. I'm really proud of the way that we have supported you through this war. I was very struck, actually, coming to whenever I've been in Ukraine, seeing literally on the streets of Kyiv flags like the Ukrainian flag here, but sometimes intertwined with a Union Jack, the British flag. And I can't quite identify why. Maybe because during the Second World War, London suffered the Blitz when the Nazis were bombing London, just as you're being bombed even now. But there is a complete belief in Ukraine amongst British people. If you look at the polling, in other words, the opinion polls, the support for Ukraine is really as strong as it ever was today, as strong as it was when Boris Johnson first set us on this path. And it's right across parties in Parliament. So it doesn't matter whether it's a Labour government now, a Conservative government that I was part of, the British people support Ukraine. We understand what you're going through, and we want to see your democracy survive and improve and enlarge and become deeper, and we want to help you on that journey. And I think if the 100-year partnership is successful, that will by a long way be my greatest success.
Thank you, Mr. Shapps, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. You're welcome.
Slava. Thank you very much. Ryan McBeth is U.S. Army veteran and OSINT analyst. Welcome to our program, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
U.S. President Donald Trump is ordering to halt shipment of military aid to Ukraine. Does this mean that the United States is siding with Russia against Ukraine in this war?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the United States is siding with Russia. I am not entirely sure what the president's strategy is here, unless it is just to end the war on any way possible, whether it's on terms that are favorable to Ukraine or not, or perhaps just on terms that would allow the United States to redevelop a relationship with Russia and trade with Russia again. So that kind of might be the method behind the madness there. I'm not saying it's right, but it might be what the president is thinking.
How harmful would be this decision for the U.S. defense industry?
It would be pretty bad. One of the things that is reliable about the United States is that we make very good weapons and we're willing to sell them to pretty much anybody. And the second we've proven ourselves as a poor supplier of weapons, then the world might go someplace else to get something that is perhaps 80% of the effectiveness of the United States weapons system for less cost. I could easily see the deal with India for our F-35s being scuttled under this because India might be reluctant to purchase a weapon system that could be turned off by the United States on a whim. I can also see other countries looking to Europe for weapon systems. When you take a look at the HIMARS system, which was developed by the United States but used in Ukraine, this is a very effective weapon system. But who's to say a country can't go to Israel to get something that is fairly similar for less money, especially if the United States proves to be a less than reliable partner when it comes to actually fulfilling the contracts for those weapons.
What is your personal take on that, what has happened in the White House between President Trump, J.D. Vance, and President Zelensky?
That was a very unique encounter. I never thought I would see the day when you would have a president intentionally bully somebody in front of the camera for what he called good television. Again, I am searching for a reason why the president would do that, and I'm coming up blank. It is my hope that there is some sort of strategic reason that he did that, but unfortunately, I cannot think of that reason.
Do you feel that this conversation could be staged before this visit?
You would think that. I'm not entirely sure why this conversation happened out in the open, unless this was supposed to be some effort at transparency. However, there are some things that you might want to say privately behind closed doors, and then you have the whole conference where everybody reads their scripted remarks. That is how I have seen pretty much every other White House meeting. I'm not sure why this one was different.
Also, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, are ready to deploy troops to Ukraine, up to 30,000 European soldiers, and to send fighter jets to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire deal. However, they're trying to get the US support for this mission, at least American jets in the air patrolling this demilitarized zone. What is your take on this idea, and do you believe, can you imagine a scenario in which Trump supports this mission, at least by providing air cover for European troops?
I'm not entirely sure if the president would support this mission in his current state of mind. But this is a mission that both France and the United Kingdom can perform by themselves. They have the troops, they have the equipment, they have the ability, they have the airborne tanker assets and airborne early warning radar assets that can perform this mission. So this is something that France and the UK can perform on their own without America's help.
Also, during our previous interview, you said that Russia would collapse and Vladimir Putin is not ready to end this war. Do you feel that Donald Trump is ready to face this reality that Vladimir Putin doesn't want this war to be settled?
I'm not entirely sure, and I say that because if the United States agrees to sanction relief as part of the deal with Russia and Ukraine, then Russia is in for a softer landing, and the idea of people rebelling against Putin for putting them out of work, that kind of becomes a lower possibility. So I believe that the president might know that if the war stops tomorrow, Russia might fall apart. But if we pursue sanction relief, then Russia won't fall apart, and the deal might be good for America as well, because we can sell our goods to Russia again. That might be the direction the president is heading in, which would be a favorable outcome to Russia.
And do you believe that reducing pressure on Russia would also force Putin, would only convince him to seek a peaceful settlement of the war?
I can't see how forcing or putting less pressure on an adversary would cause them to come to the table. Usually you put more pressure on them until they agree that the pressure is too much. So I'm not quite sure what the tactic is here.
On the other hand, we have J.D. Vance, U.S. Vice President, and during his latest interview, it seems like he is pretty confident in this uncertain strategy of Donald Trump. Moreover, he said that best way to prevent another Russia's invasion is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. Also, he's saying that it's better idea than deploying 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. What is your reaction to this statement?
Well, I believe J.D. Vance may have forgotten the fact that both France and the UK fought in Afghanistan. The UK also fought in Iraq. So I believe that J.D. Vance, he might not be familiar with that. He didn't attain a very high rank in the military, and I don't believe he went to the kind of schools where you were taught that sort of thing.
Also, I would like to cover with you another interesting statements and Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, and U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson are calling probably for a regime change in Ukraine. They said that President Zelensky should resign or seek peace in negotiations with Donald Trump. Have you expected such a U-turn in U.S. foreign policy? Because this is the same objective that has Vladimir Putin, to decapitate Ukrainian government.
You know, Ukraine is a pretty resilient country. I'm sure President Zelensky could resign and someone else could take over. And the people could still fight if President Zelensky is the one thing in between receiving aid and not receiving aid. He may understand what he has to do. Even Winston Churchill recognized the writing on the wall toward the end. I can't make that decision. I don't know whether that would necessarily be a good decision or a bad decision. That's something only the president can understand. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, and people aren't grateful for the things that you've done, and that's just life.
How do you see the things move forward tomorrow in the future? Is there a chance for a reset in the relations between Trump and President Zelensky?
I think that's always possible, and this could certainly be some sort of negotiation tactic that I am just not able to understand. I am a military guy. I am a weapons guy. I can tell you that that when it comes to politics and negotiation, my way of negotiating is you shoot the bad guys until they decide to negotiate. That's how I negotiate. So President Trump's strategy is somewhat foreign to me and just not really something I'm able to fully articulate.
And also, it seems like J.D. Vance does not understand President Biden's strategy on Ukraine to support Ukraine as long as it takes, as you just mentioned, to shoot the bad guy until he surrenders and make some concessions to you. From your perspective, why is there such a misunderstanding, and why don't they understand this strategy to put more pressure on Putin? Because after the first day of President Trump in the White House, there were some signs that he could put more pressure on Putin. He threatened sanctions against Vladimir Putin. He threatened tariffs. Why did he change his mind?
I don't know. And the funny thing about this is that it could just be as simple as in the United States, our political environment is very contentious. And so if the Democrats were for one thing, then you must need to be against it. And it could just simply come down to that. We could have a vice president who isn't very well educated when it comes to global affairs or even military affairs. And he just doesn't seem to understand the consequences of his actions. But if the former President Biden was for something, then he knows that it's good politics to be against it. And it could just be as simple as that.
And do you feel that there is a chance that Donald Trump can change his mind again and begin to understand that Vladimir Putin is the biggest obstacle for a peaceful settlement?
The president could change his mind 3 times in one day. So that is always a possibility.
And don't you think there are some discussions in Ukraine and around the globe that the reason is why Donald Trump is putting pressure on Ukraine, but not on Russia, because early stages of negotiations between US and Russia have failed because they didn't have any kind of success in that. That's why they try to put pressure on Ukraine instead. What is your take on that?
No, I think that President Trump just wants the war ended, and he doesn't particularly care who wins or loses, or at least in this case, who loses and who loses more. Because both Russia and Ukraine have lost this war. Now it's only a question of who loses more and who loses less. And I don't think President Trump particularly cares who loses more and who loses less. He just wants it done because he promised he'd get it done. And it's just easier to pick on Ukraine, who needs weapons that the United States has leverage over, than it is to pick on Russia, where the United States has less leverage, especially since we've already established sanctions and there isn't much else we can do.
From your perspective, don't you think that Trump can also change his mind and his attitude when he will see that Ukraine will be in resistance to him, will resist and will continue to fight back against Russia despite the halting of US military shipment?
In my analysis over the past 3 years, one of the things I've noticed is that the people of Ukraine are a lot like the Kurds. These are people who are fighting knowing that maybe their children or maybe even their grandchildren will never be free from the threat of Russia, but they're fighting anyway. And just like the Kurds, America betrayed them. And I don't see Ukraine ever giving up their fight for freedom.
But do you feel that Trump's team would be able to understand this in the future, maybe?
Signs appear that currently Trump's administration does not seem to grasp the geopolitical consequences of their decisions.
And do you feel that they have a plan B for this?
I do not believe that the president has a plan B. I believe he's resting on plan A, which is to stab Ukraine in the back until Ukraine decides that it's easier to give in than continue fighting.
Also, I would like to cover with you US weaponry. From your perspective, how can Ukraine survive without the shipment of HIMARS systems, missiles for ATACMS systems, and also without missiles for anti-aircraft system? What is your take on that?
It makes things a lot tougher. Ukraine might be able to get Patriot systems, or at least Patriot missiles, from Israel. It depends on the agreement Israel had with the United States about resale. Once the Patriots run out, which will probably happen by mid-spring or early summer, that's going to be an issue, and Europe needs to step up with either NASAMS missiles or something else in their inventory. It would be great if Israel could recognize that Ukraine is suffering. Israel already had to deal with their own issues when it came to theater ballistic missiles and incoming air threats. It would be nice if Israel could step up because a lot of their arms programs are very advanced. They know how to intercept missiles. So Israel might be able to get some weapons from other countries, specifically Israel. South Korea might be another. They won't be able to get HIMARS systems exactly, but Israel has a similar system that could probably be used, or Ukraine just needs to kind of invent their own system in the next 6 months. And considering that Ukraine has already developed some pretty darn advanced drone systems, that doesn't necessarily seem out of reach, although there are a finite number of research and development projects you can work on at one time. You just have a finite number of engineers and scientists.
From your perspective, can European allies provide Ukraine with missiles for Patriot systems without the permission from the United States, or with a restriction if Donald Trump says you cannot provide Ukraine with Patriot missiles because I think so, this is my decision?
That's a very good question, and that is one of the reasons why some countries like England and France they had to negotiate with the United States for Ukraine to fire Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles directly into Russia. That was because there were some components inside the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles which were made in the United States. So it depends on the agreement that the United States has with that foreign nation when the arms sale occurred. If the United States allows that country to sell weapons to a third party after a certain term on the contract, then yes, they can give those weapons to Ukraine. But if there's a clause in there that says the United States must agree to the sale, then it might be a lot tougher. And countries like the UK may have to look toward other options, maybe even look to Spain for some of the older Hawk missiles if those still are under contract.
And how can Ukraine, for example, how can European allies help Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia without ATACMS missiles? What are the alternatives? You just mentioned about the Storm Shadow missiles, but what are the other options from European allies, and how can they help Ukraine with HIMARS systems?
Well, they're not going to be able to help the Ukraine with HIMARS systems unless getting some sort of license from the United States. However, they could develop their own systems. You know, when I said that Ukraine, they could develop their own HIMARS system, they're only limited by scientists and engineers. Nothing is to say that the UK or France can't undergo some sort of program where they develop a cheaper version that is similar to the HIMARS in their own country, which they manufacture and then either sell, give, or lease to Ukraine. That is a possibility, but they need to get to work on that right now, so that way Ukraine has these weapon systems. Look, at the end of the day, weapon systems like ATACMS, it's really just a ballistic missile with some guidance. This isn't rocket science. Well, it is rocket science, but it's not. These are all problems that have been solved. And they can solve this problem. They just need to get to work on it immediately.
So you're confident that Europe can replace American aid for Ukraine?
I don't believe that Europe has a choice. Right now, Europe is looking at America, and they know that if they do something America doesn't like, America might cut off access to weapons systems. That doesn't help with the F-35. That's already in the bag. They already purchased that. They have to keep continuing purchasing parts for that. But there is a reason why the French weapons manufacturer, Rafale, why their stock went up 20% a couple of days ago. It's because Europe has just realized that America is not a reliable partner when it comes to selling weapon systems.
Also, I would like to cover with you artillery shells. Ukraine is using artillery on a large scale on the battlefield. Yeah. However, Ukraine is using American-made artillery and American-made shells. how can Ukraine solve this issue with shells for artillery systems, and can Europe replace US producing these shells? How can they solve this issue?
Well, Europe produces 155 millimeter shells. Ukraine might also be able to get them from Israel. They might be able to get them from South Korea. Europe has the capacity, but literally everything rolling off the production line will go to Ukraine. There will be very little left for European militaries, which means that Europe needs to stand up some factories, and they need to do it immediately.
And do you also expect Trump's administration to halt intelligence sharing with Ukraine? Because according to the latest news, also Ukraine receives support from the US intel community regarding the air alerts, regarding the providing information for people about the Russia's attack using ballistic missiles and other air assets. What is your take on that?
Yes, that is certainly possible. The United States either will do that if they haven't already, just as another way to make life harder for Ukraine in order to get them to bend the knee to Russia. I believe that France and the UK might be able to take over some of that role, although they have fewer satellites, and so their coverage of what's going on may be significantly degraded. However, if France or the United Kingdom are able to get early warning aircraft in the air, that will actually be better than periodic satellite footage.
Thank you, Ryan, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much for inviting me.